Hi, it's good to be back with you all, and I'm doing a series of 4 short Bible studies. You can make them longer at home if you want to by doing your own study on God's provision. I did a few weeks ago a very short meditation on that, and we're going to explore a bit further by over these 4 sessions looking at one story from the Old Testament and one from the New to see how God provides for us in different ways. So today I'm going to look at how God provides for our physical needs. And the story I've chosen from the Old Testament is found, if you want to follow it in your own Bibles, in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 to 16. So that's 1 Kings 17, verses 8 to 16. It's at a time of great famine in the land. And this is what happens. The word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, indeed, a widow was there, gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Please, bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink." And as she was going to get it, he called her and said, "Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." So she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks, that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it, and then we will die." Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me. And afterwards make some for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Elijah. So let's just put a context to that story. There was great famine in the land, and God had been providing for Elijah supernaturally. If you read back before the passage I've chosen, he was sending ravens to Elijah with both bread and meat in the morning and in the evening. So that was God's supernatural provision. But then God says to Elijah, "I'm changing that. I'm going to stop the ravens from coming and feeding you. You are now going to travel a short distance, and you will meet a widow, and she will provide for you." So you could argue from Elijah's point of view, so far so good. Now, if we then are introduced to the widow, she started that morning probably not looking forward to that day. She was poor. There's no mention of her husband. She was a widow, so I guess her husband had died. She lived with her son in a land where there was famine, no provision. And she's collecting some firewood to make the last of her little, call it a cake in those days, we'd call it a small roll really of bread, and that would be her last meal, when suddenly this man of God says to her, "Will you provide for me?" And she says, "But I haven't got enough for myself and my son." And he says, "Well, you go ahead, do what you were going to do this today, do what you planned, make this small little roll of bread and give it to me." This was not exactly what she wanted to hear. I'm sure if she'd started the morning by praying to God, she'd been praying for provision, not that she would be asked to give away the very little she had. She was looking at provision that was inadequate for her and her son, let alone for somebody else. But Elijah says to her, "No, you give that to me, and you will find, because God is in this, God is saying that he will renew your provision day by day, and your flour will not run out, and your oil will not run out." She had a choice, didn't she? And we always have choices with God. She could have clung on to the little bit that she had, or she could have chosen to trust God and give away what she had and see what would happen. We know, because we know the end of that story, that she chose to give that last bit of bread to Elijah, and God honoured his word, as he always does. And he provided for her and Elijah, because God is always true to his word. So let's turn now and look at a New Testament story. We've just seen in the widow Zarephath that God fed a widow, her son, and his prophet. We're now going to look at God's provision for a whole crowd of 5,000 people. A different sort of scale, principle is the same. God's provision. This story is taken up in a number of the Gospels, but we're going to look today at the account in Luke's Gospel, and that is Luke chapter 9, verses 12 to 17. And of course, we know it as the feeding of the 5,000. And verse 12 says this: When the day began to wear away, the 12 came and said to him, Send the multitude away, that they may go into the surrounding towns and country, and lodge and get provisions, for we are in a deserted place out here. But he said to them, You give them something to eat. The disciples said, We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for these people. For there were about 5,000 men. Then Jesus said to his disciples, Make them sit down in groups of 50. They did so, and made them all sit down. Then Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the multitude. So they all ate and were filled, and 12 baskets of the leftover fragments were taken up by them. So let's have a look at what was operating here. Jesus had been feeding them spiritually. They'd obviously taken in all the teaching. It was spoken with authority. It was feeding their souls. And so the day had worn on. They were in a deserted place. Even if there had been villages nearby, the people were poor. They wouldn't have had enough to feed them. And so the disciples choose not to make that their responsibility. They say, look, the people are now saying they're hungry. They haven't eaten. Probably many of them wouldn't have even eaten before they came. You need to send them away. They need to take responsibility for getting something to eat. Jesus is saying there's no provision for them around here. The villages are a long way away and the people there are poor. So he says to the disciples, you give them something to eat. The disciples thought and felt that this was an unrealistic request of Jesus. So they look to their human resources and they find they're inadequate. Even if we could walk to the villages, we don't have any money to buy food. And we've already asked around in the crowd, and all we've come up with is some boy that's got 5 small little rolls and 2 fish. Totally and utterly inadequate. You notice then that Jesus doesn't argue with them. He is now more interested in how he is going to distribute the provision. To Jesus, he knows his Father's already made that provision. What he's thinking about is, well, how do we distribute the food to 5,000 people? And although you will be very familiar with this miracle, I want you now to think about being one of those disciples, or even being one of the crowd that was hungry. Jesus says to his disciples, get them to sit down in groups of 50. That would actually have been very significant in those times, because that's how the Romans divided up their soldiers, in groups of 50 and groups of 100, to bring order. So if you do the maths, if there were 50 groups of 5,000 people, that means there would have been about 100 people in each group. Very manageable, especially if they were sitting in an orderly way. We know that there were 12 disciples. So if you do your maths and put 12 into 100, it means that each disciple would have been responsible for approximately 8 groups. So Jesus was talking about the strategy of how to give out the provision even before anybody could see the provision. That's our God, isn't it? And so we're then told in verse 16 that he takes what there is. He took the inadequate provision of 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he asked the Father to bless them, and he broke them. Now, if you are one of those disciples, you are going to look very closely at what is happening in Jesus' hands. So where does the miracle take place? I don't think Jesus stood there for the next 6 hours breaking endless bread or pieces of bread that became loaves and giving them out. I believe he broke the loaves or the rolls that were in his hand and they became whole. And then he gave them to his disciples, looked at them and said, right, go to that group over there and break the bread, just as I have. And as the disciples broke the loaf that they had, the 2 halves would form 2 loaves. They would give that to the man on their left and the man on their right. They would look at them and say, break it, give it to the next. I believe the miracle was involving everybody. They knew the miracle had come from God. They knew the source of the miracle. Jesus had offered it up in front of all of them to his Father in heaven. But they were all participants in the miracle as well as in the food. And God, to demonstrate his generosity, said, look, we've been here all day. The villages know. Many of you have come from the surrounding villages. You're going to walk back there now. Take something back for your wives and children. God's provision is not only enough, it's always enough for us to give. So what do these 2 stories have in common? And what do they tell us about God's provision? Well, firstly, and it's very obvious when I state it, but we need to get a hold of this, is that God only provides when we have a need. I'm going to say that again so you actually think about it. God only provides when we have a need. If we don't have a need, we don't need his provision. So the need has to come before we see God's provision. So I ask you now, what are your needs today? Are you expecting God to meet them? Are you looking for his provision? Because just as for Elijah, the widow of Zarephath and her meagre little bit of flour and oil did not look on the surface as though his needs could be met. The little rolls and fish of the little boy in the crowd of 5,000 did not look as though that would be provision for everybody. But God is the provider. So that's the first thing. Elijah, the widow, both had the same need. They were hungry. They had no ready supply of food. The crowd before Jesus was hungry. They had no means to satisfy their hunger. But God saw the need and provided. I often wonder what story that little boy with the loaves and fishes told his mum when he got home that day. Go, Mum, it was amazing. That little packed lunch you did for me. It fed 5,000 people. I wonder what her response was. I've told you not to lie. I've told you not to exaggerate. But Mum, it was true. I bet she was glad that what she thought was going to be provision for her son actually turned out to be used by God to be provision for 5,000 sons. Our God is a God of increase. Secondly, I think what we learn from both stories is that in order to see the Lord's provision, we have to come to the end of our own resources. relying on our own strength, relying on how we used to live our life, relying on the little props that kept us going, that have suddenly been taken away. Why? So that we can get depressed, so that we can become fearful? No. So that we can rely only on God. That's what he wants, to draw us closer. And that's what he's doing in this time. He's providing his fellowship, his presence. That's worth more than any of the props that we may have used in our lives. Thirdly, in both those stories, it shows us that God uses something that he's already given us in order to provide for our needs. But at the right time, he increases it. When you became a Christian, God put his Spirit within you. It's there. But it may have been small. It may have got dampened down as different trials and things have come along in your life. And it's just depressed his Spirit. But actually, this is the time when his Spirit in you is going to increase and going to become more powerful. That's why we can truly say that the joy of the Lord is our strength. You may say, well, I don't feel very joyful. Then ask the Lord to provide you. He will, but it won't be your joy based on something that we can get or eat or see. It will be his joy. The joy of his presence. The joy of focusing on what it truly means to be saved. And so fourthly, we can learn that he needs us to trust in him. Not to be fazed by the limits of our resources, the limits of our government resources, the limits of circumstances. That God is truly able to provide for our physical needs. So let us choose to trust him. May God bless his word to you, and may you look yourselves for the many other examples in his word where God has provided physically for his people. Bless you.